I think the Trump win has been like a pivotal change in that. And, you know, with the ETFs seeding Bitcoin, with Trump apparently calling back all the physical gold, like draining Europe of their physical gold, you know, we could see, you know, another 20 years, 20, 30 years extension into the US dollar as the world reserve settlement currency. Maybe even longer, because like freedom and the dignity of the individual and due process and like individual rights, these things that have made America great as a massive superpower, like, you know, it seems Europe might be turning away from some of that. And China, you know, never really had it. And so, you know, you have to have this freedom of speech and this freedom of the individual in order to be engaged in economic calculation. Otherwise, how are you going to allocate resources other than profit and loss? I mean, you're going to have to use some other system, and that means you're going to have violence injected in there somewhere, whether it's politically or with regulation or whatnot. And that's going to the voluntary transactions are going to decrease. People are going to have to find workarounds. It's going to basically result in a waste of capital. This is the economic calculation problem and why socialism fails. And so, you know, if America is turning towards, you know, freedom, that means they're going to be able to be a lot more economically productive. And look at the GDP between Europe and the US over the last 20 years. Like, Europe's the same, and America's grown like, you know, now twice the size of the EU. So, you know, you play that out, and we start, instead of subsidizing these poor choices, and what I mean by poor is these choices that lead to people becoming poor because they're not able to be engaged in the economic calculation. Instead of subsidizing Europe's poor choices, instead we just slap tariffs on all their crap. And that just drives them further into like paying the cost of the consequences of their choices, instead of Americans paying the cost of the consequences of their choices. Like, I mean, my grandpas were at D-Day and Battle of the Bulge. Like, you know, they're free currently because they're free riding off of like my grandpa's like blood, sweat, and tears, right? And I don't think Americans are going to go save these Europeans this time around. Doesn't seem to be, you know, part of the Trump agenda. So, and, you know, U.S. probably isn't going to go liberate the Chinese people from the Communist Party either. So, but if we have that freedom, we're going to be this economic engine that's just generating huge amounts of wealth and keeping it for, you know, the benefit of the American people. So I think that's, you know, and that's going to help strengthen our, you know, the dollar is going to have much longer term reign because of that. And then also, you know, if we're fostering the economic and the monetary innovation as opposed to engaging in the monetary repression, and that gives an alternative to like EU people, for example, using US dollar-based stablecoins. I mean, the EU is already squawking about it. Oh, you're infringing with these stablecoins. You're infringing on EU monetary sovereignty. Well, yeah. I mean, it's really nice to be able to have seigniorage, especially seigniorage of other people's, like of other institutions' people, right? So if we can be seeding US dollar stablecoins into South America and into Europe and into like Chinese hands that are evading the Great Firewall, like because they're using Starlink or whatever, like this only helps strengthen the dollar. And, you know, if we have the productive capacity in the U.S. because we have, you know, the economic and the freedom of speech and these other principles that enable that, like, you know, we own those top 3 search results. And so the dollar gets to be have an extension in its life as the world reserve settlement currency. And any competitors, like, they bump up against our 2 bodyguards of gold and Bitcoin. Gold, because we're draining all the physical gold. So we have that bulwark. You know, we put that moat around our world reserve settlement currency, and then we put the Bitcoin moat around the gold moat. And so by seeding it into the hands of the individuals and onto the balance sheets of our companies and into portfolios like BlackRock's doing. So now it's like, yeah, that US dollar could have a much longer life to it than, you know, if we are not engaged in the monetary innovation and we allow this like $36 trillion to continue snowballing. We don't cut the spending, and like the debt gets out of control and the interest, you know, like the dollar could have a much shorter time horizon. But Trump's like just a totally different timeline than what we saw with the Harris regime.
Totally. And I think before this Trump timeline, it seemed like we were heading very much into a world as described in The Sovereign Individual, where perhaps we're talking about just individual city-states and a return to sort of like medieval Europe in many respects from like a geopolitical standpoint. But you're right, it is a totally different landscape now. And I think one of the other interesting ironies that really has developed in the last like 6 years, obviously Tether had been around for much longer, but is perhaps really the two key innovations here, or the two biggest use cases and two biggest sources of product market fit are sort of Bitcoin as a store of value, and then stable coins basically dollarizing the world and exporting dollars to even more people that might have otherwise never really had access to it in the same way.